Hello friends, how are you? I'm Ari Thurger, and today I'm going to speak about the Animistic Divine, the importance of understanding the animistic conceptions of the spiritual reality and bring back such spiritual perceptions into modern day neo-pagan religions. Nowadays there is a wondrous variety of neo-pagan religions and neo-pagan movements. Unfortunately, only very few are trying to actually perceive and interiorize the pagan mentality. Most neo-pagan religious movements and organizations in the Western world are actually more like paganizations of Christianity, or Christian philosophical and religious ideas disguised as paganisms. What I mean with this is that many modern-day neo-paganisms still have a very non-pagan perception of the spiritual, and the mindset towards the understanding of the divine sphere is still focused on a clear detachment between the human and what is perceived to be the divine. Many neo-pagans and many neo-pagan religious organizations don't care about reshaping their mentality into a pagan mentality, or rather into a tribal, indigenous pagan mentality, but prefer to continue to deal with the divine as something that exists above us, detached from our reality, gods and goddesses somewhere on an unreachable space that we must contact with through prayers and rituals to acquire their blessings. Always in this level of subjugation, and some religious figure speaking for the divine and passing on the message to the followers of the religion. Like I said, a paganization of Christianity. Continuing with the same religious traditional motif of a spiritual hierarchical structure in which the individual stands at the bottom, the priest figure above, and the divine on the very top of this hierarchical pyramid. This isn't just a question of Christian mentality brought into paganism, because this hierarchical religious structure was actually implemented by Indo-Europeans, by Eastern polytheistic cultures whose social realities were very much patriarchal in nature and focused on the military success to aggrandize their power. Their entire social system was set up to support and perpetuate the taking of land, to support their communities, to raise more warriors and take more land. We could say that Indo-Europeans have almost built a cultural, religious and linguistic empire. Indo-European migrations to every corner of the ancient world and the indigenous populations absorbed the Indo-European cultural reality, either by force or eventually attrition due to conflicts, and alliances were made to stop the bloodshed. Yes, attrition in the entire sense of the word, gradually making something weaker and destroying it, until eventually the strongest power rules over the others and a scenery of subjugation is implemented, and the indigenous peoples lost much of their ancient religious beliefs. Fortunately, the Indo-Europeans were not naive and dim-witted oafs, so a lot of the indigenous spiritualities of the peoples they came in contact with were also incorporated into the religious reality of Indo-Europeans. Not everything was utterly lost. But animism, which is the basis of all religions, an animistic understanding of the spiritual, was put aside in the Indo-European societies. Even among Indo-Europeans, there was a clear detachment from the spiritual and the religious. The warrior figure held the military, economic, political and religious power, while his wife, the wife of the chieftain, was the figure linked to magic, divination, somewhat keeping a few ideas of the spiritualities of the past before Indo-Europeans implemented their patriarchal, hierarchical social structure. People started to rely very much on sky gods, gods above, impossible to reach. So prayers and rituals, various religious ceremonies were held to call upon the powers of the sky gods and hope they would bestow their blessings upon the human suppliants. While the chieftain's wife was only called upon for divination matters, because she maintained the contact with the gods of the past, the gods of the land, the gods closest to mankind. So, of course, it's hard for neo-pagans to understand animistic notions because they are the absolute opposite of the religious realities we have been dealing with for thousands of years. Many people still look at the sky and expect the divine to intervene. Many people still have rooted in their minds this clear detachment from the spiritual, because the gods are somewhere else out of this reality and we must beg to them, call upon them, invoke them to have the crumbs of the bread they eat. The great problem here is idolatry, the worshipping of idols, because of all these religious fantasies we have created of gods from the sky. And this entire mentality turned to subjugation, because the elite held the religious power. And if you wanted the favor of the gods, you had to rely on the elite, the chieftain, the tribal leader, the warlord, the king, emperor, and so on and so forth, was the figure that also held the religious power, and the gods spoke through the elite, through the priesthood, controlled by the elite. And a panorama of subjugation was implemented, obviously, to control the masses. People started to worship the gods of the elite, and therefore the members of the elite themselves, because they held the religious power and they performed the ceremonies. Idolatry is one of the worst things that destroys spirituality. Idolatry is a religious construction. People misshapen their focus away from the reality and turned it towards a fantasy of their own construction, taking an idea and creating a false image, taking animistic notions of the spiritual and creating their own perspectives and turning them into a religion that others must follow because they are in control and promise salvation and protection. Self-centered worship rather than deity-centered. But deity-centered in the sense of being in contact with the spiritual rather than in contact with a human figure representative of a few self-notions of what that figure believes to be real, true and right. These religious notions are status symbols rather than guiding notions towards spiritual freedom and enlightenment. There are as many ways to perceive as there are eyes to see. And make no mistake, many religious organizations to this day, including neo-pagan religious organizations, still have this mentality and still want followers. This has nothing to do with spirituality. This is religion. Unreal notions glorifying ancient civilizations and placing them in all manner of wrong geographical realities motivated by politics. You want spiritual freedom? Then perhaps it's time to stop following idols and return to the indigenous animistic spiritualities of the past, before the warlords came to destroy everything and took away spiritual freedom, the same warlords of the civilizations, certain people and certain religious organizations still glorify and continue to feed the same historical lies and passing them as the truth. Historical lies concocted in the 19th century for political purposes to enhance national pride. And that pride relies on a legacy that was never real. You want to be proud of the past of your nation? Then seek the truth. Go back to the origins before all this civilized sphere of subjugation we have been living in, praising idols and turning our backs to the natural world, our true homes, our true origins, starting to construct a more animistic mentality of our indigenous past. And yes, indigenous. And I'll tell you why I'm using this term. I'm using this term indigenous because I think that is what better describes the animistic notions of a people towards the spiritual. An indigenous spirituality is the product of an underlying relationship between humans and the natural world. Everything within animism is perceived to be an endless interaction with the spiritual reality because absolutely everything that surrounds us is spiritual. This world is already in the spiritual reality and everything possesses a conscious and it is sentient and we can interact with always, every day, at every moment. We are surrounded by the spiritual because we live in the exact same universe where the spiritual constantly manifests itself. And many pagan religions of the past still had these animistic notions, even after having been influenced by Indo-European religious perspectives. Where the elite rules, things were quite different. But those who lived outside the civilized reality and relied very much on the natural world to be alive, their religious realities were quite different. Still very animistic. An integral and integrated relationship between the human and the natural surroundings. That's what being a pagan truly is, I think. It's not about the worship of idols, the worship of many gods, or notions of servitude in the relation between the human and the divine. The pagan is the person who maintains a respectable, healthy and symbiotic relationship with the spiritual world that surrounds the individual. The pagan relies on the spiritual entities all around and constructs a relationship of mutual benefit with the spiritual. That's what many neo-pagan religious organizations constantly neglect. It's always about the gods and the connection with the gods and offerings, prayers, rituals and ceremonies to the gods, and completely put aside the relationship with the spirits of the land, with local spiritual entities, with the natural phenomenon, with the ancestral spirits and the spiritual network itself, the spiritual ecosystem in which the gods are also part of, as they are also spiritual entities. But not the entire focus and not the primary focal point standing there in the spotlight as if the gods were the center of every possible thing that exists. I believe that is exactly the notion we must focus on to understand the actual pagan mentality. Not treating the gods as if they were the center of everything and everything moves around them and we must constantly please them, but rather the gods are spiritual entities like any other and we can maintain a healthy and constructive relationship with them. That is animism in its true essence, a symbiotic relationship with the spiritual. Even nowadays, among pagans and pagan scholars, pagans in the academic field, they try to pass on this idea that ancient pagans only had this sin of idolatry because in study we focus too much on one tiny fraction of the pagan societies of the past, and that is the reality of the urban centers. the place of the elite, the place of the religious, the religions of the elite, or the religions of the state, the official religions, and completely neglect the greater spiritual reality outside the civilized panorama or outside the urban panorama. I said this before on the video about animism. In the academic field, the cult of the spirits, be that of the land or phenomenon, house spirits, ancestors, etc., that cult is seen as low worship, so it's animism, while the cult of the gods is seen as high worship, so polytheism in its full sense, religion. But in truth, in ancient pagan societies, these two realities were not divided. This division is created in the academic field because, in general, the world is under the influence of the three main Near Eastern monotheisms: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. These religions nowadays are absolutely detached from the animistic past, and the animistic notions that those religions had and are still perceptible in some traditions have been completely put aside. Because of this, such religions created a collective consciousness that we all share, that makes us create this division between animism and religion. Because to such monotheisms, and even the perception we have of ancient pagan cultures such as Greek and Roman, which we perceive to be highly civilized, in our modern mentality, we can only understand animism to be something primitive, and religion is sophistication. This mindset cannot be applied to ancient pagan cultures, because within pre-Christian religions, it's actually very difficult finding this division. There was a fully integrated combination of deities, fairy-like beings, and ancestral worship, land spirits, the cult of natural phenomenon, and relevant natural features. Even nowadays, world religions still have clear traces of animism still attached to them. Animism has never been destroyed or replaced. It has been here all the time, within the persistent belief in spiritual entities such as fairies, elves, trolls, giants, familiar spirits, etc. In the pagan past, there wasn't animism and religion. Animism was part of religion. And before a clear religious structure of the elite as a subjugation tool, animism was all that people had. Everything was seen in an animistic perspective. That is, everything belonged to the spiritual. The notion of the divine is this: they are spirits that coexist with humans, and humans coexist with them and other spirit beings. Deities have been associated with places, forests, mountains, rivers, animals, and such places scattered throughout the natural landscape were considered sacred, because that is where the divine dwells, where the human interacts with the divine, and vice versa, through the direct contact with the natural world. This phenomenon, or this spiritual animistic perspective, is found in almost any indigenous people. This perception that the human being is part of nature, and as such of the spiritual world, rather than being separated from it. In fact, in an animistic perspective, there is no sense of natural as a word that distinguishes between the wild world and the civilized world. Because in an animistic perspective, there is only the natural and everything is contained within it. This understanding that man is part of the natural world, inserted directly into the spiritual world, is essential in any neo-paganism to once and for all interiorize the pagan mentality and end the veneration of idols that clearly continues to destroy the interaction of man with the divine. People jump from religion to religion and continue to feel empty, alone, and completely disoriented because we continue to carry the same understanding of idolatry to any kind of religion, when what we really should do is to interiorize the animistic mentality that brings us closer and in direct contact with the spiritual. Due to various religious systems whose philosophical and religious perceptions are world-denying views, we have been accustomed to this way of thinking for a long time, and we are limited to the idea that paganism is disconnected from the earth due to the veneration of gods living in a world beyond our reach and the places of the afterlife, and to which we will only have access if we die or if we consume hallucinogenic substances to enter in a trance state and rise to meet the divine. The divine, the spiritual, is everywhere, absolutely everywhere, and you can go out to meet it and interact with it. Perhaps one of the greatest reasons why many people fail to interact with the divine, even among pagans, is because people don't actually believe in the divine, don't actually believe in the spirits we often call gods and goddesses. I see that among many pagans. They call themselves pagans, but they do not believe in the gods as individual entities. Many people believe the gods are the anthropomorphization of natural forces or representations of human behavior, which is perfectly understandable. But that idea is precisely due to religion. And if we study the religions of the past, we continue to see a clear evolution of the gods as representations of the natural and or psychological phenomenon, and clearly figures constructed according to the needs of the societies. This is idolatry once again. So it's understandable why many people, even pagans, don't actually believe the gods are individual spiritual entities. Because of religion, because of the lack of response to the thousands of questions and doubts we have about the spiritual. Because people are sick and tired of the same religious organizations making a mockery of the spiritual and turning it into something to enhance personal wealth and power and have as many followers as possible, to maintain people bound to fantastical notions that give no clear answers, maintaining people in fear because people's fears are profitable, because people will continue to seek answers that might give them illusions of a certain sense of security and peace of mind. Religions created a clear detachment from animistic perceptions, and it was precisely religion that started to destroy the belief in the gods. So, how can you be pagan and not believe in the gods as actual spiritual beings? I'm not saying you are wrong to believe the gods are metaphors for a variety of situations, activities, phenomenon, and human psychological aspects. I'm only here giving you a different view, a different perspective from the animistic point of view. If animism is the perception that the world is teeming and infused with spirits, and by living in this world we are coexisting with such spirits, then what we call gods are also spirits. They are here with us. In animism, it is perceived that everything contains a spirit, a conscious, a sentient existence, even natural phenomenon. So therefore, we can contact with it, work with it, and create a connection. Certain spirits just happen to be more powerful than others due to their very spiritual nature. And certain spirits propitiate all sorts of things. That is also their nature. If everything that exists is spiritual, it has a function. It has its own mind and purpose. It has potential. So the spirits we call gods have a mind of their own and are fully capable of acting in whichever way they please, just as we do. They may or may not help us, interact with us, coexist with us. So the gods, as spiritual beings, we can communicate with them and form all sorts of relationships with them. They exist in a variety of places which we can physically go to and interact with such spirits. The gods we know of today, all these names and attributes, qualities and celebrations around them, were once spirits, real spirit beings our ancestors had contact with, interaction. And these spirits were the subject of many conversations. Our ancestors were nomadic peoples. They would often be on the move and interact with other cultures, other peoples. And the real interaction with the spirits was expressed and shared among many cultures. And the stories passed around, and human beings started to elevate these spirits to the category of the divine. And we progressively moved away from the contact with the spirits and started to praise the stories about them. And we constructed figures to express the ideas we have of the spirits of old. The contact with the spirits was lost when all we had were the ideas and more stories added to the stories, more concepts, new perspectives, and we were left with the gods we know of today, which are clear embodiments of thousands of constructed ideas and a variety of perceptions from various cultures. So yes, it is easier to see the gods as metaphors and anthropomorphizations of all sorts of phenomena, because that's exactly what they are. But they were once, originally, spirits. They still are. They are still out there. They are still here. But again, idolatry has made a fracture on spirituality and opened an abyss separating us from the spirits. We were left on the other side of the gap with our idols, with the status symbols, with misshapen constructions of the spiritual, creating false images. On the other side of the gap, the original gods are still there, waiting, being what they have always been, spirits. The problem is that we spend too much time discussing the nature of the gods. On the academic field, surely, it's perfectly understandable, and the study of comparative religions and mythologies is of the utmost importance to understand the origins of these religions and the cultural backgrounds of the past. But in our own spiritualities, we spend too much time discussing the nature of the gods, trying to understand what they are, what's their essence, and we mixture realities that can't possibly be blended. You do not present an academic work relying solely on personal gnosis as your source of information. No one will take you seriously. The same way, in spirituality, you should not rely on somebody else's perceptions of the spiritual. It's important, very much important actually, to be aware of the academic work in relation to the gods, so we can understand the amount of human influence behind the conception of the divine. I see a lot of people who speak about the gods and describe the gods, and then the descriptions are what they read in some book, and it's clearly a cultural construction of an era. I mean, I have seen and heard people say a lot about the contact they had with the gods and describing the gods, and they clearly have no notion that what they are saying is the image they have created because of descriptions of the gods in that particular manner. For instance, in Norse mythology, how the gods are portrayed by Snorre Sturluson, an Icelandic Christian of the 13th century, writing for Christians. And his perception of the gods was influenced by Christian philosophical and religious teachings. And the gods he described are not the same gods described in earlier versions. And many modern pagans say they have seen the gods and then they describe them as Snorri described them. A man who wasn't even pagan and didn't believe in the heathen gods at all. Snorri's purpose in writing the Prose Edda wasn't to keep the ancestral memory alive or praise the old gods or anything of the sort. Snorri wrote the Prose Edda for other Christians, and he seems to have been motivated by the wish to show how his pre-Christian ancestors had anticipated Christian learning in their myths and poetry. He retells the Old Norse myths, creating his own construction of the myths, not completely destroying the myths and creating something completely new, and not reporting on Christian influences in the Old Norse religious sources, but rather consciously seeking common ground between the heathen past and his contemporary Christian times. He created loads of parallels with Christian religious ideas to show his Christian compatriots that his forefathers had anticipated Christian teachings. So you see, it's very important to be aware of the sources and all the academic work, so we won't continue to create false notions of the divine and continue on with this idolatry around figures who are nothing more than fantasies. What I mean with all of this is that we spend too much time hating on each other because of each one's perception of the gods. It's like trying to understand the nature of a tree. We know a lot about trees, but we can't fully grasp their true nature, their true essence, and their minds. The same thing is applied to our perception of the gods. We can know a lot about them because they live with us all around and we can interact with them, just as we can interact with trees. But we can't possibly truly understand their minds because they have minds of their own and purposes, just as we can't sometimes understand our own minds and the minds of all the people around. People waste an awful lot of time trying to understand what the gods want, and we apply to the gods our own notions of right and wrong, and what is acceptable and what is moral or immoral. Every spiritual being has a mind of its own, just as everyone else that exists has a mind of their own. All our theological conceptions say more about us and how we see ourselves than they say about the real nature of the gods. The gods are real. The gods are out there, but they aren't these figures we have imagined and forced people to blindly follow those very beautiful and sexy gods with clear notions of right and wrong and what is fair and what isn't. Very muscular male gods and goddesses with big tits, and each with specific human attributes. So of course, when you believe in a deity to have that specific aspect and those specific traits, you will have a terrible hard time believing in them when something comes up that completely demonstrates something different than what you believed in. We will constantly be disappointed and remain in doubt if we keep believing in the gods as physical beings with a specific human form and specific human conceptions of reality. This is also one of the reasons there is still a lot of racism among various religious systems, especially within paganism, unfortunately. Oh, that God is represented with a skin shade darker than mine. Clearly not for me, my people are lighter of skin. Oh, that God has blue eyes, very Indo-European. What? This God is not blonde? Then it is not my God. You are venerating images that are not real. If the gods are spiritual beings, do you really think they went through genetic mutations just to specifically look like you? In animism, the spiritual manifests itself in animate and inanimate things. And so the divine can manifest itself in a variety of things. The gods we venerate today are cultural constructions. indeed the anthropomorphization of the old gods, the spirits of the natural world and of the cosmos. An animistic understanding of the spiritual is very important, and a lot of stupidity will cease to exist. As I've said before, we have created a lot of images of the gods. Gods with one eye, gods with red hair, dark gods, gods half flesh and half rotten, gods with magnificent beards. Imagining this and such other fantasies greatly diminishes our understanding of the divine. The images of the divine is one of the worst traps that destroys faith, because faith, spirituality, will be limited by one's imagination, and that imagination is restricted to the images given to us. Enlightenment is to understand that divinity has no bodily categories. Physical shape can never be applied to divinity, because the divine is a wondrous variety of forces without physical or mental limitations. The divine is free from such limitations, as should we in our perceptions of the world. Remember this, we do not see the world as it is. We see the world as we think it is. Reality is nothing more than our own perception towards what surrounds us, and our perception is limited by the physical and by religious illusions that create narrow ideas. Just because we don't see it doesn't mean it isn't there. There are as many ways of perception as there are eyes to see. So, animism is the belief that everything has a spirit. It has a consciousness, and therefore it is sentient and has potential. A river, a forest, a rock, a tree, the very wind, a hill somewhere on the field has a spirit. And this spirit can be the living spiritual entity of that particular place or thing, or it can be a spirit that came to live in there and became a guardian of place or benefactor of some sort. We can interact with it. We cannot think about it as having a human physical representation, but rather it is a consciousness that resides in there. And I understand why it is so hard to believe in that in this highly industrialized modern world. Most of us live in the cities, concrete walls all around, technology, the deafening buzz of electronics and cars all around. There is barely any tree, any glimpse of nature, and if we want to look at the sky, most of the time we have to look at the reflections of it on the windows of the tall dark buildings. Most of us live in a reality detached from the natural world. But if we go into nature, the spiritual is hard to miss. We can feel it, hear it, we can sense it. This is also one of the big problems, living in a materialistic reality where everything is perceived to be physical and can only be physical in order to exist and have a function. We started with idolatry, the worship of images, and then we never stopped. And everything ends up revolving around this limited perception that everything that exists is physical and can only manifest itself if it has matter, if it has a body, a physical representation. The metaphysical foundation of contemporary Western society is materialism, this very illusory awareness that all that exists is matter and everything is the product of its interactions. So obviously, how can we believe in the spiritual if the spiritual has no physical manifestation, doesn't belong to the physical and has no matter? Therefore, in this materialistic era, there are no such things as land spirits, ancestral spirits, spirits of the house, and other spirits such as gods. And we have come to a point, if you think otherwise, if you believe in the spiritual, it goes against the materialistic limited perception of our societies, and therefore you are wrong. And quite often the argument is there is no scientific proof for the spiritual, which is a poor argument clearly uttered by someone who doesn't know what science truly is. Science is a process to try to understand the truth, not to claim what is the truth. Animism in many ways is a superior foundation to materialism, because materialism deals with matter only, and it is understood that matter is the fundamental substance in nature, and that all phenomenon is the result of interactions between matter. And we reduce reality to being existence motivated by objects. We reduce life itself to objects, and without a physical representation, there is no existence. While animism is the idea that everything is not a thing, it's not a mere object, but it is a person. It is a living being, a spirit that can live in matter but doesn't exclusively require matter to exist, because it is consciousness and not matter that is fundamental to existence. Can anything exist without the consciousness of its own existence? There is no perception of existence without a consciousness. If we know we exist, we have a consciousness, and that consciousness is not the product of matter interacting with other matter, but it is existence that gives life to matter, and not the other way around. Matter does not produce consciousness. It's consciousness that produces existence. I shall explore a little bit more about this on the next video. The point here is that having an animistic understanding of reality is fundamental, especially to respect life and the world we live in, if we understand it to be a living spiritual entity. And it's also fundamental in the spiritual panorama, of course, obviously. The gods are real, they are spiritual entities, and they are all around, and we can create a symbiotic relationship with the spirits. But more on that later. Alright, my dear friends, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed this video. See you on the next video, and as always, tack för idag.